Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the chaotic, devastating, and frankly, world-altering end of World War I. I mean, after 4 years of a conflict that literally rewrote the rules of modern warfare, how do you even pull the plug on something of that sheer magnitude? We're going to break that all down today, and we're starting with a haunting prediction about the so-called peace that followed.
Just look at this chillingly accurate reaction from French Marshal Ferdinand Foch. When he saw the terms of the Treaty of Versailles that officially ended the war in 1919, he supposedly stood up from the table and dropped this absolute bombshell of a quote. "It is not a peace, it is an armistice for 20 years. Talk about hitting the nail on the head, right? This perfectly sets the stage for our deep dive today into the messy, devastating transition of November 1918. He knew the war to end all wars hadn't actually solved a thing.
All right, part 1, the 11th hour.
So the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. It's a date permanently etched into global history. But here's the crucial thing we often forget. An armistice is really just a ceasefire. It is not a formal peace treaty. And tragically, because it was merely a scheduled halt to buy time for negotiations, heavy fighting carried right on until 11 a.m. Soldiers were literally still dying in the mud that morning. In fact, the last recorded casualty fell at 10:59 a.m. Think about that. 1 minute before the guns were scheduled to fall silent.
Now, the actual terms signed in that famous railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne, they were relentlessly strict. Germany was required to evacuate all occupied territories, surrender massive quantities of military equipment, we're talking artillery, submarines, the whole shebang. They even had to send their warships straight to Britain and agree to eventual, albeit unspecified, reparations. These conditions weren't a negotiation. They were explicitly designed to leave the Central Powers completely helpless and entirely unable to resume the war.
Moving on to part 2, collapse from within.
So you might be wondering, why on earth did the German military agree to sign such punishing, one-sided terms when their troops were actually still standing on enemy soil in places like Belgium, France, and Russia? Well, to understand that, we really have to look back at the German homeland. Basically, a massive systemic collapse took the empire down from the inside out. We're talking chronic inflation, severe civilian starvation, largely caused by a crippling British naval blockade, and a catastrophic rock-bottom loss of morale. It just completely broke the war effort. They literally ran out of both the logistical capability and the basic human will to keep fighting.
And this collapse happened rapid fire. First off, you had angry German sailors at Kiel mutinying because they just refused to sacrifice any more lives for a lost cause. Well, that sparked massive protests and strikes by a starving civilian population. The pressure got so intense it forced Kaiser Wilhelm II to literally abdicate his throne and bolt to the Netherlands. So then Prince Maximilian has to hand the reins over to a brand new civilian government under Friedrich Ebert. And what does Ebert do? He immediately begs the Allies for a ceasefire.
Which brings us to part 3, the human and economic toll.
Now, while civilians in cities like London, Paris, and New York were erupting into joyous global celebrations on November 11th, the smoke was clearing on the front lines to reveal just unimaginable devastation. To really grasp the reality of the meat grinder that was finally shutting down, take a look at this number. 57,470. That represents the horrific British casualties suffered on just the very first day of the Battle of the Somme in 1916. Over 19,000 men killed in a matter of hours. The bloodiest day in the history of the British Army. And that was just day 1 of a 5-month struggle that failed to even secure a real breakthrough.
When we zoom out, the macro-level loss is honestly almost incomprehensible. Across both sides, over 9.4 million military personnel were killed. The Central Powers alone lost 2.6% of their entire population just in military deaths. The war pulverized a generation of young men, leaving hardly a street in Europe without a drawn blind to mourn the fallen.
But you know, the tragedy wasn't just isolated to the battlefields. The economic ruin was absolute. Nations were left with completely shattered infrastructure, urban famine, and this mountain of debt that crippled European per capita income growth all the way through 1929. The whole delicate, complicated economic organization of Europe hadn't just been put on pause. It had been thoroughly, brutally dismantled.
Let's look at part 4, the fall of empires.
So the aftermath of this unparalleled destruction didn't just end a war, it completely redrew the global map. The familiar pre-1914 world of old dynastic rulers? Erased. Gone. In its place emerged a fragmented landscape of new, independent nations, fragile republics, and these highly volatile shatter zones, basically large tracts of territory where the disappearance of old frontiers created spaces without clear state authority. The Great War had essentially unleashed a wave of chaotic decolonization right inside Europe itself.
The big takeaway here is that in just a few short years, 4 historic, massive empires simply vanished from the earth. The Russian Empire fell to Lenin's Bolsheviks. The German Hohenzollern dynasty was ousted and replaced by the Weimar Republic. The Austro-Hungarian Empire completely splintered into independent states once its multi-ethnic army lost morale. And the Ottoman Empire collapsed entirely, which, as we know, set the stage for a total reshaping of the Middle East.
And finally, Part 5, a 20-year armistice.
So with the empire shattered and the fighting officially halted, the victorious Allied powers gathered to formally dictate the peace. But we really have to stop and ask ourselves, was the sequel inevitable the moment the ink dried in Paris? Did this peace actually guarantee another global war? Let's take a closer look at the terms they handed down.
Right, so the Treaty of Versailles was dictated by the victorious Big Four: Britain, France, the US, and Italy. The defeated nations, they weren't even invited to negotiate. They were simply told to sign. Germany was relentlessly stripped of roughly 13% of its European territory, lost every single one of its overseas colonies, had its military heavily restricted, and got slapped with demands for massive economic reparations to pay the Allies back for civilian damages.
But the deepest cut of all, and for sure the most deeply resented, was Article 231. This became infamous as the War Guilt Clause. It forced a completely humiliated Germany to formally accept full responsibility for causing all the loss and damage of the war. I mean, for a nation that was already starving and economically broken, this immense psychological blow laid a very, very dangerous foundation of resentment.
And that resentment was fueled by a really powerful, fatal misconception. See, because the armistice was signed while German troops were technically still occupying enemy territory, and because Allied boots never actually marched into Germany to conquer it, a dangerous myth started brewing. A lot of Germans falsely believed their military was undefeated on the battlefield and that they had simply been stabbed in the back by the new civilian politicians and revolutionaries back home.
Which leaves us with a final, pretty provocative thought to consider today. You look at the immense human cost, the erased empires, the crippling reparations, and a humiliated nation firmly grasping onto a myth of betrayal. Did the men who signed the armistice in that railway carriage actually end the Great War? Or just like Marshal Foch warned, did they just hit pause for 20 years, setting the stage for an even darker chapter in human history? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the history that shaped our world.